They say blood is thicker than water. But what happens when the person who nearly spilled your blood carries your family name? What happens when the woman who calls you mom becomes the one who wants you gone? My name is Angela Brooks, though. Most folks call me Angie. And at 73 years old, I never imagined I'd be lying in a hospital bed, staring at ceiling tiles, knowing that my own daughter-in-law tried to kill me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You might think you know how this story ends. You might think, this is just another tale of family drama, another sad story about generational conflict. But let me tell you something. Sometimes the universe has a way of serving justice that's sweeter than any revenge you could ever plan. Sometimes, the very action someone takes to destroy you becomes the rope they use to hang themselves. This isn't just a story about attempted murder. This is a story about greed, about lies, about a woman so consumed with getting what she thought she deserved that she forgot to look where she was stepping. And when she finally fell, she fell harder than she ever pushed me. So settle in, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family, about trust, and about the dangerous lengths people will go to for money they never earned. Let me start from the beginning, because every good story needs context. And honey, this context is everything. I've lived in the same house for 47 years. It's a beautiful colonial on Maple Street, the kind with wraparound porches and mature oak trees that make the whole neighborhood look like something out of a magazine. My late husband Robert and I bought it when our son Michael was just 3 years old. We poured our hearts, our savings, and our dreams into every room, every renovation, every careful improvement over the decades. Robert passed 5 years ago, after a long battle with cancer. Those final months were the hardest of my life, watching the man I'd loved for 51 years slip away piece by piece. But even in his final days, he made me promise something that I've held onto like a lifeline ever since. Angie, he whispered to me one October evening, his hand weak but warm in mine. Promise me you'll keep the house. Promise me you won't let anyone pressure you into giving up our home. Michael's a good boy, but he's not always the strongest when it comes to standing up for what's right. I promised him then, and I meant it. This house isn't just 4 walls and a roof to me. It's where I brought my baby home from the hospital. It's where Michael took his first steps across the hardwood floors that Robert installed himself. It's where we hosted 47 Christmas mornings, countless birthday parties, and where I held my husband's hand during his final breath. But promises, I've learned, become complicated when other people have different plans for your life. Michael met Sarah 3 years ago at some corporate networking event. He was 45 then, recently divorced from his first wife Jennifer, and honestly, I thought he might never find love again. The divorce had been rough on him, not bitter exactly, but sad in that quiet way that makes a mother's heart ache for her child. Jennifer was a sweet girl, but they'd grown apart over the years. And when they finally called it quits, Michael threw himself into his work as a financial advisor with the kind of intensity that worried me. So when he started talking about Sarah, I was hopeful, genuinely hopeful. He'd light up when he mentioned her name, would spend hours telling me about their dates, their conversations, their shared love of travel and fine dining. Sarah was 38, never married, and worked as a marketing director for some tech startup. She was beautiful in that polished, professional way, always perfectly put together, always saying the right things, always smiling at exactly the right moments. The first time Michael brought her to Sunday dinner, I tried so hard to love her. I really did. I made my famous pot roast, the one that Michael had been begging me to make since he was 12 years old. I set the dining room table with my good china, the spode pattern that Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. I even wore my nicest dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that I usually saved for church. Sarah walked into my home that evening like she was inspecting it for purchase. Her eyes swept over everything: the family photos on the mantel, the antique furniture that had been passed down through my family, the carefully maintained hardwood floors, the crown molding that Robert had spent 3 weekends installing. She smiled and said all the right things, complimented the roast, admired the china, but there was something calculating in her gaze that made me uncomfortable. "What a lovely home, Mrs. Brooks," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "It must be worth quite a lot in today's market." The comment struck me as odd. Who discusses property values at a first dinner? But Michael was beaming, so proud to be showing off both his mother and his girlfriend, and I pushed my discomfort aside. Maybe she was just making conversation. Maybe I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into innocent small talk. Over the following months, as Michael and Sarah's relationship grew more serious, I tried to build a connection with her. I really did. I invited her to go shopping with me, suggested we get our nails done together, offered to teach her some of my family recipes. But Sarah always had an excuse. She was too busy with work, had plans with her friends, wasn't really interested in cooking. The distance between us might have remained just that. Distance, if not for what happened 18 months ago. Michael proposed to Sarah on Valentine's Day in what I had to admit was a beautifully romantic gesture. He took her to the same restaurant where Robert had proposed to me all those years ago, got down on one knee right there by the piano, and presented her with his grandmother's engagement ring, the one that had been in our family for 3 generations. I was happy for them. Truly, I was. Despite my reservations about Sarah, I wanted my son to be happy, and he was clearly head over heels in love. We started planning an engagement party, and that's when things began to change in ways I couldn't have predicted. "Mom," Michael said to me one evening in March, about a month after the proposal. He'd come over for dinner, something he'd been doing less frequently since Sarah entered his life. "Sarah and I have been talking about our future, about our plans after we get married." I was loading the dishwasher, my back to him, but something in his tone made me pause. There was a hesitancy there, an uncertainty that I'd learned to recognize as a warning sign from his childhood. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, turning to face him. "I'm so happy you two are building a life together." He cleared his throat, a nervous habit he'd never outgrown. "The thing is, Mom, we've been looking at houses, and the market is just so expensive right now. Sarah thinks. Well, we both think it might make sense for us to move in here. With you." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because the idea was necessarily unreasonable, the house was certainly big enough, but because of the way he'd presented it. Not as a question, not as a request, but as a decision they'd already made. "Move in here?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "All 3 of us, you mean?" "Just temporarily," he said quickly, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Until we can save up enough for a down payment on something really nice. Sarah has some ideas about how we could update the place, maybe make it work better for all of us." That phrase, "make it work better for all of us," sent a chill down my spine. This was my home. The home I'd shared with Robert for almost 5 decades. The home where I felt closest to his memory, where every room held decades of carefully preserved moments. "What kind of updates?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Michael finally looked at me then, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him knew what he was asking wasn't fair, but another part, the part that was clearly being influenced by Sarah, had already convinced him it was reasonable. "Nothing major," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe modernize the kitchen, update some of the bathrooms. Sarah thinks the master bedroom could be expanded into the guest room next to it. You know, to give us more space as a married couple." The guest room he was talking about had been Robert's study. It was where he'd worked on his carpentry projects, where he'd kept his tools and his books, where I still went sometimes just to sit in his chair and feel close to him. The idea of tearing down that wall, of erasing that space, felt like someone was asking me to erase Robert himself. I see, I said carefully. And where exactly would I fit into these plans? Well, that's the thing, Michael said, and his discomfort was becoming more obvious by the minute. Sarah suggested that maybe it would be better for everyone if you considered downsizing. There are some really nice senior living communities in the area, Mom. Places where you could have your own space but also have help if you need it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Support systems, activities, people your own age. The betrayal cut deeper than I can adequately describe. My own son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd supported through his divorce and his struggles, was essentially asking me to give up my home so he and his fiancée could have it. Senior living, I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. You mean you want me to move into a nursing home? It's not a nursing home, Mom. These are independent living facilities. Really nice ones. You'd have your own apartment, your own kitchen if you wanted to cook, but you wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore. The rational part of my brain understood that he was trying to frame this as being for my benefit. But the emotional part of me, the part that felt like I was being pushed out of my own life, was screaming in protest. This big house, I said slowly, is my home, Michael. It's where your father and I built our life together. It's where you grew up. It's where I want to spend the rest of my days. But Mom, be realistic. You're 73 years old. What happens if you fall? What happens if you have a medical emergency and there's no one here to help you? At least in a senior community, there would be people around, medical staff on site. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and realized that somewhere along the way, Sarah had convinced him that I was a burden, that my presence in my own home was an inconvenience that needed to be managed rather than a life that deserved respect. I'm not ready to give up my independence, Michael, I said firmly. And I'm not ready to give up this house. Your father made me promise to keep it, and I intend to honor that promise. Something shifted in Michael's expression then. The pleading, uncertain look was replaced by something harder, more determined. It was a look I'd seen before, usually, when he was about to do something he knew was wrong, but had already convinced himself was necessary. Mom, I know this is hard, but you have to think about what's practical. Sarah and I are going to be married. We need space to start our family. And honestly, with your arthritis getting worse and your blood pressure issues, it's not safe for you to be living alone in a house this size. The mention of my health issues felt like a low blow. Yes, I had arthritis. Yes, I took medication for my blood pressure. But I was hardly an invalid. I drove myself to the grocery store, maintained my garden, cooked my own meals, and lived a perfectly independent life. The suggestion that I was somehow incapacitated felt both insulting and manipulative. I'm managing just fine, thank you, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. And I don't recall asking for your advice about my living situation. You don't have to ask, Mom. I'm your son. It's my job to look out for you. Your job, I said, is to respect me, and right now, you're not doing that. We stared at each other across my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd made him countless meals, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd comforted him through heartbreaks and celebrated his achievements. The distance between us felt wider than the few feet of hardwood floor. I'm going to marry Sarah, Mom, he said finally, with or without your blessing, and we're going to need a place to live. I was hoping we could work something out that would benefit everyone, but if you're going to be stubborn about this, we'll just have to find another solution. The threat was implicit but clear. If I didn't cooperate with their plans, I'd be cut out of their lives. My son was essentially holding our relationship hostage to get what he wanted. I see, I said quietly. And what does Sarah think about all this? Sarah thinks you're a wonderful woman, he said, but the words sounded rehearsed. She just wants what's best for everyone. She wants us to be a family. A family. The word should have warmed my heart, but instead, it felt like a cold stone in my chest. Because the family Sarah wanted clearly didn't include me. At least not in any meaningful way. After Michael left that night, I sat in Robert's old chair in what had been his study and tried to make sense of what had just happened. How had my relationship with my son deteriorated so quickly? How had a woman I barely knew managed to convince him that his own mother was a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved? I called my sister Helen, who lives in Florida, with her husband. Helen is 2 years younger than me and has always been my voice of reason, the person I turn to when the world stops making sense. He said what? Helen's voice was sharp with indignation when I told her about the conversation. He wants me to move into senior living so he and Sarah can have the house, I repeated, the words no less painful the second time around. Angela, Marie Brooks, you listen to me, Helen said, using my full name the way she had when we were children, and she was trying to make a point. That house is yours. You and Robert worked your whole lives to pay for it, to make it a home. No one, not even your son, has the right to push you out of it. But what if he's right? I asked, voicing the doubt that had been gnawing at me. What if I am being stubborn? What if something happens to me and I can't take care of myself? Then you'll deal with it when it happens, Helen said firmly. But you don't give up your life because of what might happen someday. And you certainly don't give it up to make room for some woman who's clearly got her eye on your property value. Helen's words were comforting, but they didn't solve my problem. Over the following weeks, the tension between Michael and me grew worse. He'd call less frequently, and when he did, our conversations were stilted and uncomfortable. Sarah, who had never been particularly warm toward me, became even more distant. Then came the wedding planning, and with it, a new set of challenges I hadn't anticipated. We want to have the reception here, Sarah announced one afternoon in May. She'd come over with Michael to discuss wedding details, though it was clear the decisions had already been made. The backyard is perfect for a tent, and it would be so much more intimate than a hotel ballroom. I looked out at the backyard that Robert and I had spent 30 years cultivating. The rose garden, the mature trees, the carefully maintained lawn. It was beautiful, certainly, but it was also my private sanctuary, the place where I felt most connected to the memories of my life with Robert. How many guests are you thinking? I asked, trying to be reasonable. About 150, Sarah said casually, as if she were discussing a small dinner party. 150 people, in my backyard, trampling through my garden, using my bathrooms, tracking through my house. The thought made me feel sick. That's quite a few people, I said carefully. Are you sure the space is adequate? Oh, we've already had an event planner come look at it, Sarah said brightly. She thinks it's perfect. We'd need to do some landscaping, of course. Move some of those rose bushes. Maybe take down a couple of the older trees to make room for the tent. But it's going to be absolutely gorgeous. Move my rose bushes, take down my trees. The casual way she discussed dismantling my garden felt like she was planning to rearrange furniture in her own home, rather than proposing to destroy something that had taken decades to create. Those roses were planted by my husband, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Some of them have been there for 20 years. I know, and they're beautiful, Sarah said with that practiced smile. But think about how lovely it will be to have new landscaping, more modern, more streamlined. After the wedding, you'll have a whole new garden to enjoy. A new garden that I hadn't chosen, hadn't planned, hadn't wanted. A garden that would hold no memories of Robert, no connection to the life we'd built together. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with such extensive changes, I said. Sarah's smile faltered slightly, and for just a moment I saw something flash in her eyes that looked like annoyance, maybe even anger. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Of course, it's your decision," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I just thought you'd want Michael's wedding to be perfect. I thought you'd want to do everything possible to make it special for him." There it was, the guilt trip. The suggestion that if I didn't agree to let them destroy my garden, I was somehow failing as a mother. It was manipulative and unfair, and it worked exactly as Sarah had intended. "Of course I want Michael's wedding to be perfect," I said, feeling trapped. "I just need some time to think about it." "Sure," Sarah said, but her voice had gone cold. "Take all the time you need. We'll just have to make other arrangements if this doesn't work out." After they left, I walked through my garden with tears in my eyes. Every plant, every tree, every carefully tended flower bed represented years of Robert's and my shared labor and love. The idea of watching strangers tear it apart felt like watching them tear apart my heart. But I also knew that if I said no, I'd be painted as the difficult mother-in-law, the selfish old woman who put her flowers before her son's happiness. Sarah had positioned the request in a way that made any refusal seem cruel and unreasonable. That's when I began to understand that this wasn't really about the wedding at all. It was about power. It was about establishing who would make the decisions in what was still legally my home. It was about Sarah testing my boundaries to see how far she could push me. And I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. The wedding planning continued through the summer, and with each passing week, I felt more and more like a stranger in my own life. Sarah had opinions about everything. The flowers, my roses weren't sophisticated enough. The catering, we needed to upgrade the kitchen appliances to handle the event. The guest bathroom, it needed to be completely renovated before the wedding. Each suggestion came with the same underlying message. This house wasn't good enough as it was. I wasn't good enough as I was. Everything needed to be changed, updated, improved to meet Sarah's standards. Michael, for his part, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension. He was caught up in the romance of planning his wedding, excited about his future with Sarah, and either couldn't see or chose to ignore how his fiancée was systematically undermining his relationship with his mother. The breaking point came in August, just 2 months before the wedding. I was in the kitchen making dinner when Sarah let herself in through the back door. She'd never asked for a key, but somehow she'd gotten one, and she'd taken to coming and going as if she already lived there. "Angela, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that immediately put me on edge. I turned from the stove where I was stirring soup. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Sarah sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had eaten thousands of meals, where Michael had done his homework, where we'd played cards and shared stories and built a lifetime of memories. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the future," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "About what's going to happen after Michael and I are married." "I'm listening," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to be careful. "The truth is, Angela, this arrangement isn't working. Michael is torn between his loyalty to you and his commitment to our marriage. It's putting a strain on our relationship, and frankly, it's not fair to any of us." I turned off the burner and faced her fully. "What arrangement would that be? You living here, in this house that's far too big for one person. Michael spends half his time worrying about you, wondering if you're safe, if you're lonely, if you're managing okay on your own. It's not healthy for him, and it's not healthy for you either." The way she said it made it sound like she was doing me a favor, like she was the voice of reason in an unreasonable situation. "I manage just fine," I said quietly. "Do you?" Sarah's voice was sharp now, the pretense of concern dropping away. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're clinging to a house and a lifestyle that you can't really maintain anymore. And it's affecting everyone around you." I felt my cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. This is my home, Sarah. I've lived here for 47 years. I raised my son here. I'm not ready to give that up. Ready or not, it's time, she said, leaning forward. Michael deserves to start his marriage without having to worry about his mother's stubborn refusal to face reality. And honestly, Angela, you deserve better than rattling around in this big, empty house, holding on to the past. The cruelty of her words took my breath away. She was talking about my life, my memories, my connection to Robert, as if they were nothing more than inconvenient obstacles to her plans. What exactly is it that you want from me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had finally decided to stop pretending. I want you to sell this house, she said simply. Michael and I have found a lovely senior community about 20 minutes from here. You can take the proceeds from the sale and buy yourself a nice apartment. Maybe have some money left over for travel or hobbies or whatever it is you want to do with your remaining years. And what happens to this house? Michael and I buy it from you, at a fair price, of course. Below market value considering the family connection, but fair. You get to downsize to something more manageable. We get to start our marriage in a real home instead of cramped apartments or rentals, and everyone wins. Below market value. The phrase hit me like a slap. She wanted me to sell my home, the home Robert and I had paid for, the home that was worth significantly more than we'd originally paid thanks to decades of improvements and a strong real estate market, for less than it was worth so that she and Michael could profit from my sacrifice. I see, I said slowly. And if I refuse? Sarah's mask slipped entirely then, and I saw the cold calculation that had been hiding behind her smiles and concerned words. Then Michael will have to choose, she said, between his mother who won't let him live his own life and the woman he loves who's trying to build a future with him. And honestly, Angela, I don't think that's a choice you want to force him to make. The threat was clear and brutal. Agree to sell my house or lose my son forever. I stared at this woman who had inserted herself into my life, who had systematically worked to isolate me from my own child, who was now demanding that I give up everything I held dear so she could have what she wanted. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Sarah said, standing up. But don't take too long. Michael and I would like to have this settled before the wedding. It would be such a shame if family drama had to overshadow what should be the happiest day of our lives. After she left, I sat at my kitchen table and cried. I cried for Robert, who wasn't there to help me navigate this impossible situation. I cried for Michael, who had somehow become a stranger, willing to sacrifice his mother for a woman who clearly had no love for me. I cried for myself, facing the possibility of losing everything I cared about. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to grow alongside my grief. Anger, determination, a stubborn refusal to be pushed out of my own life by someone who had no right to demand such a thing. Sarah had underestimated me. She'd assumed that because I was older, because I was alone, because I loved my son, I would be easily manipulated into giving her what she wanted. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning, I called my lawyer, James Patterson, who had handled Robert's estate and had been our family attorney for over 20 years. Angela, what a pleasant surprise, he said when his secretary put me through. How are you holding up? I've been better, Jim, I said. I need to ask you some questions about my house, about my rights, and about what would happen if someone tried to force me to sell. There was a pause. Is someone trying to force you to sell your house? I told him everything. About Michael and Sarah's demands, about the pressure to move into senior living, about Sarah's ultimatum the night before. Jim listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Angela, he said finally, I want you to listen to me very carefully. That house is yours. You own it free and clear. No one, not your son, not his fiancée, not anyone, can force you to sell it. And anyone who tries to coerce you into selling could potentially be charged with elder abuse. Elder abuse? The term shocked me. Financial exploitation of elderly people is a serious crime, Jim explained. And what you're describing, the pressure tactics, the threats to cut off contact with your son, the attempts to convince you that you're incapable of living independently, those are all red flags for potential abuse. The conversation with Jim gave me strength, but it also made me realize how precarious my situation really was. Sarah wasn't just greedy, she was potentially dangerous. And my son, whether through manipulation or genuine belief, had become her ally rather than my protector. Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. Michael would call and casually mention how much he was looking forward to starting fresh after the wedding. Sarah would drop by with real estate listings for senior communities, always with that bright smile and concerned voice. The message was clear. The decision had been made, and I was expected to comply. But I had made a decision too. I wasn't leaving my home. I wasn't giving up the life Robert and I had built. And I wasn't going to let fear of losing Michael prevent me from standing up for myself. What I didn't realize was that Sarah had made a decision as well, and her decision was far more dangerous than I could have imagined. The night everything changed was October 15th. I remember the date because it was Robert's birthday, and I'd spent the day at his grave, bringing him flowers and telling him about what was happening with Michael and Sarah. It sounds foolish. Maybe talking to a headstone, but it brought me comfort to share my troubles with him, even if he couldn't answer. I came home that evening feeling drained and sad. The house felt particularly empty, and I found myself missing Robert with an intensity that surprised me. 5 years after his death, I'd thought I'd learned to live with the grief, but sometimes it still hit me like a physical blow. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard Sarah's key in the back door. My heart sank. The last thing I wanted was another confrontation, especially on Robert's birthday. "Angela, we need to finish our conversation," she said without preamble, not even bothering to say hello. I turned to face her, noting that she looked different somehow. More agitated than usual, less controlled. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was something manic in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "I told you I needed time to think," I said calmly. "You've had 3 weeks," she snapped. "Time's up. Michael and I need an answer, and we need it tonight. And if I say no?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're not going to say no, Angela, because you're going to listen to what I have to say, and then you're going to realize that you don't have a choice anymore." Something in her tone made me step back instinctively. This wasn't the controlled, manipulative Sarah I'd grown accustomed to. This was someone on the edge, someone who had lost patience with subtle tactics. "I don't know what you mean," I said. "I mean that I know about your little conversation with your lawyer," she said, and my blood ran cold. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Michael tells me everything, Angela. Everything. Including the fact that you're trying to find ways to fight us on this. How did she know about Jim? Had Michael been monitoring my phone calls? Had she?" "I have every right to consult with my attorney," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "About elder abuse?" Sarah's voice was mocking. "About financial exploitation?" "Really, Angela, that's quite an accusation to make against your own son." The realization hit me like a truck. Michael had told her everything I'd shared with him in confidence. Every doubt, every fear, every conversation with my lawyer. My own son had betrayed my trust completely. "Michael wouldn't," I started to say. "Michael would do anything for me," Sarah interrupted. "Anything, including things that might hurt you if you don't start cooperating." What do you mean by that? Sarah smiled, and for the first time, I was genuinely afraid of her. I mean that accidents happen, Angela. Especially to elderly people living alone in big houses. Especially to elderly people who are becoming increasingly isolated from their families because of their stubborn, unreasonable behavior. The threat was unmistakable, and I felt my knees go weak. She was talking about hurting me, maybe even killing me. You're talking about murder, I whispered. I'm talking about unfortunate accidents that happen to difficult old women who won't listen to reason, she said casually. Falls downstairs, kitchen fires, medical emergencies that go unnoticed for hours because no one checks on them anymore. I backed toward the phone, thinking I could call 911, call Jim, call someone who could help me. But Sarah was younger, faster, and she stepped between me and the phone. Now, she said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that was more terrifying than her threats. No need to involve anyone else in our family discussion. This is between you and me, Angela. Between the woman who's been living in the past and the woman who's planning for the future. Michael would never... I tried again. Michael will never know, she said simply. He'll be devastated, of course. His poor mother, living alone in that big house, finally having the accident that everyone saw coming. He'll probably blame himself for not insisting that you move somewhere safer sooner. The calculation behind her words was breathtaking. She'd already planned it all out. Already figured out how to make my death look accidental, how to manipulate Michael's grief to serve her purposes. But it doesn't have to come to that, she continued, her voice becoming reasonable again. Almost. Kind. All you have to do is agree to sell the house. We can have the papers drawn up tomorrow. You can be moved into a nice apartment by the end of the month. Everyone lives happily ever after. I stared at her. This woman who had smiled at my dinner table, who had worn my grandmother's ring, who was planning to marry my son. And I realized that I was looking at someone genuinely evil, someone who would kill me without hesitation if I didn't give her what she wanted. But I also realized something else. Sarah had made a crucial mistake. She'd revealed her true nature too soon, shown her hand before she'd secured her victory. And that gave me something I hadn't had before. Knowledge of exactly who I was dealing with. I need to sit down, I said, letting my voice shake, playing up the frightened old woman persona she expected. This is a lot to process. Of course, she said, her voice softening as she sensed victory. Take your time, but remember, Angela, I'm not a patient person, and I'm not going to let you stand in the way of my future with Michael. I moved toward the kitchen chair, my mind racing. I needed to get her to leave, needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to protect myself from someone who was clearly willing to commit murder to get what she wanted. But as I reached for the chair, my foot caught on the edge of the rug. That had been slightly askew since Sarah had entered. I stumbled, reached out to steady myself, and that's when Sarah made her choice. Instead of helping me, instead of stepping back to give me room to recover my balance, she stepped forward and gave me a hard shove toward the staircase that led from the kitchen to the second floor. Whoops, she said, but her voice was cold. Calculating. Careful there, Angela. These old houses can be so dangerous. I fell backward, my hands reaching desperately for the railing, my mind screaming that this was it. This was how I was going to die. The stairs rushed up to meet me, and the last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the sound of Sarah's laughter, high and bright and utterly without remorse. But I didn't die. And that, as it turned out, was Sarah's first and most critical mistake. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. When I opened my eyes, the world was a blur of white ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights that seemed to pierce straight through my skull. The antiseptic smell of the hospital filled my nostrils, and every part of my body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder. My left arm was in a cast, my ribs screamed with every breath, and there was a bandage wrapped around my head that made it difficult to turn my neck. But I was alive. Against all odds, despite Sarah's murderous intentions, I was alive. The first face I saw was Michael's, hovering over me with an expression of concern that might have warmed my heart under different circumstances. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair disheveled, and he looked like he'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen him. "Mom, oh God, Mom, you're awake," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctors weren't sure. You've been unconscious for 2 days. We were so scared." 2 days. I'd lost 2 days of my life to Sarah's violence, 2 days during which she'd probably been playing the role of the concerned future daughter-in-law, probably weaving whatever story she'd concocted to explain my accident. "What happened?" I whispered, my throat feeling like sandpaper. I needed to hear her version, needed to understand what lies she'd already told before I decided how to respond. "You fell down the stairs," Michael said, taking my uninjured hand in both of his. "Sarah found you at the bottom of the kitchen stairs. She said she'd come over to talk to you about wedding plans and heard you cry out. By the time she got to you, you were unconscious and bleeding." Of course, Sarah had found me. Sarah was the hero in this story, the caring future daughter-in-law who discovered the tragic accident and called for help. I wondered how long she'd waited before calling 911, how long she'd stood there looking at my broken body, calculating whether I was going to survive. "I don't remember falling," I said carefully, watching Michael's face for any sign that he doubted the official story. "The doctor said that's normal with head injuries," he said quickly. "You hit your head pretty hard. You have a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured wrist. But you're going to be okay, Mom. You're going to be okay." He kept repeating it like a mantra, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But what he didn't understand was that being okay wasn't just about healing from my physical injuries. It was about surviving in a world where my son's fiancé wanted me dead and had already tried once to make that happen. "Where is Sarah?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "She's in the cafeteria getting coffee. She's been here almost as much as I have, Mom. She's been so worried about you. She keeps saying she should have gotten to you sooner. Should have prevented the fall somehow." The performance was masterful. I had to give her that. Sarah had positioned herself as both the discoverer of my accident and the guilt-ridden witness who wished she could have done more. It was a narrative that painted her as caring and selfless while absolving her of any suspicion. "I'd like to see her," I said, though what I really wanted was to accuse her of attempted murder. But I needed to be smart about this. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. "Of course," Michael said, squeezing my hand. "I'll go get her. She'll be so relieved that you're awake." As he left the room, I tried to piece together what I remembered from that night. The conversation in my kitchen, Sarah's threats, the deliberate shove that had sent me tumbling down the stairs. But I also remembered something else, something that might be important. The look in Sarah's eyes when she'd pushed me. It hadn't been the look of someone acting in the heat of the moment. It had been cold, calculated, purposeful. She hadn't pushed me hoping I might fall. She'd pushed me intending for me to die. When Sarah walked into my hospital room, she was carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression of such convincing concern that I might have believed it myself if I hadn't known better. "Angela, thank goodness you're awake," she said, setting the flowers on the bedside table and reaching for my uninjured hand. "I've been so worried about you. We all have." Her touch made my skin crawl, but I forced myself not to pull away. I needed her to think I believed her story, needed her to feel confident that her plan had worked even though I'd survived. "Thank you for finding me," I said quietly. "Michael told me you heard me fall." "I wish I'd gotten there sooner," she said, and there were actual tears in her eyes. Either she was an exceptional actress, or she'd convinced herself that her version of events was true. I keep thinking that if I'd been just a few minutes earlier, maybe I could have prevented it somehow. What were you coming to see me about? I asked, genuinely curious about what excuse she'd invented for being at my house that night. Wedding plans, she said without hesitation. I wanted to apologize for being so pushy about the reception, about the changes to your garden. Michael made me realize that I was being insensitive, asking you to alter your beautiful landscaping for one day. I came over to tell you that we'd found another venue. It was a good lie, the kind that made her look considerate and reasonable. It also explained why she'd been at my house without making it seem suspicious. But I remembered what she'd actually come to say, the ultimatum she'd delivered, the threats she'd made. None of that had been about wedding venues or garden parties. That was thoughtful of you, I said, playing along. I hope you weren't too shaken up by finding me like that. It was horrible, she said, and her voice trembled convincingly. Seeing you lying there, unconscious, bleeding. I thought I'd lost you before I even had a chance to really get to know you. The irony was breathtaking. She was describing the exact outcome she'd hoped for while pretending to be devastated by it. The important thing is that you're going to recover, she continued. The doctors say you'll be able to go home in a few days. Though Michael and I have been talking, and we really think this incident proves that you shouldn't be living alone in that big house anymore. And there it was, the real reason for her visit, the next phase of her plan. My accident would now be used as evidence that I was too frail to live independently, that I needed to be moved somewhere safer for my own good. I suppose you might be right, I said carefully. This has certainly been a wake-up call. Sarah's eyes lit up with what looked like genuine happiness. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, Angela. I know it's hard to give up your independence, but we just want what's best for you. Well, what did you have in mind? I asked. Well, there's a lovely senior living community called Golden Years Manor. It's only about 15 minutes from here, and they have everything you could need. 24-hour medical staff, activities, meal service if you want it. You'd have your own apartment, but you'd also have support when you need it. Golden Years Manor. She'd clearly done her research, had probably toured the facility, and picked out exactly where she wanted to warehouse me. I wondered if she'd already put down a deposit, if she'd been that confident that her plan would work. It sounds wonderful, I said, though the words tasted like poison. When would this happen? As soon as you're ready, Sarah said quickly. We don't want to rush you, of course, but the sooner you're somewhere safe, the better we'll all feel. And what would happen to my house? Well, that's something we can discuss later, when you're feeling better. The important thing right now is getting you healthy and settled somewhere appropriate. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was already planning the next steps, already figuring out how to get me to sign over my house once. I was tucked away in the senior facility, isolated from anyone who might question the arrangement. I appreciate you thinking of my welfare, I said. I really do. Of course, Sarah said, squeezing my hand again. We're going to be family, Angela. Taking care of each other is what families do. After she left, I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what had just happened. Sarah had attempted to murder me, and now she was using my survival as an opportunity to achieve the same goal through different means. If she couldn't kill me outright, she'd bury me alive in a senior facility and take my house anyway. But she'd made several mistakes, and I was beginning to see how I might be able to use them against her. First, she'd assumed that I wouldn't remember what had really happened that night. She was counting on the head injury to cloud my memory, to make me doubt my own recollections of events. But my memory was crystal clear, at least about the important parts. Second, she'd moved too quickly to capitalize on my accident. Instead of waiting to see how I'd recover, instead of giving me time to naturally come to the conclusion that I needed help, she'd immediately started pushing for the senior living arrangement. It made her seem overeager, too ready with a solution to a problem that had supposedly just occurred. And third, she'd underestimated my ability to play the game she'd started. She thought that because I was older, because I was injured, because I was alone, I'd be easy to manipulate. She was about to learn otherwise. Over the next few days, as I recovered in the hospital, I had plenty of time to observe and plan. Michael visited every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with Sarah. When he was alone, he was the son I remembered, caring, attentive, genuinely worried about my well-being. But when Sarah was with him, he became someone different, stiffer, more formal, more focused on practical matters than emotional ones. I began to understand that Sarah's influence over him was more complete than I'd realized. She hadn't just convinced him that I needed to be moved out of my house, she'd fundamentally changed how he saw me. In her version of reality, I wasn't. His mother who deserved love and respect. I was a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be managed, an obstacle to his happiness with her. On my 4th day in the hospital, Dr. Martinez came to discuss my discharge plans. He was a kind man in his 50s who reminded me a bit of Robert, and he'd been treating me with the sort of respectful concern that I'd almost forgotten I deserved. "Your injuries are healing well, Mrs. Brooks," he said, reviewing my chart. "The concussion symptoms are resolving, your ribs are mending, and the wrist fracture is stable. I think we can get you home tomorrow." "That's wonderful news," I said, though the word home carried complicated feelings now. "I do want to talk to you about safety precautions, though," Dr. Martinez continued. "Falls are a serious concern for people in your age group, and you've now had a significant fall with serious injuries. We need to make sure your living environment is as safe as possible." "What would you recommend?" "Well, the social worker mentioned that your family is considering senior living options. That might be something worth exploring, especially given what happened. These facilities are designed with safety in mind, and they have staff available if you need assistance." The social worker. I hadn't spoken to any social worker, which meant that Michael or Sarah had initiated that conversation. They were already laying the groundwork for my transition out of my home, already enlisting medical professionals to support their narrative. "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for such a drastic change. That house has been my home for almost 50 years. Dr. Martinez nodded sympathetically. "I understand the emotional attachment, but to be honest with you, Mrs. Brooks, at 73, living alone in a large house after a serious fall, it's a risk. What if this happens again and there's no one there to find you?" It was the same argument Sarah had made, the same pressure Michael had applied. Everyone was so focused on what might happen that no one was asking what I wanted to happen. "What if we made some modifications to the house?" I asked. "Safety rails, better lighting, maybe a medical alert system?" "Those are all good ideas," Dr. Martinez said, "but they don't address the fundamental issue, which is that you're isolated. The real danger isn't just falling, it's falling and having no one know about it for hours or days." He was right, of course. If Sarah had actually killed me that night, if she'd succeeded in her plan, my body might not have been discovered for days. The isolation that I'd treasured as independence had become a vulnerability that could be exploited. "I understand your concerns," I said. "Can I have some time to consider my options?" "Of course," Dr. Martinez said, "but don't take too long. The longer you wait to make these kinds of decisions, the harder they become." After he left, I sat alone in my hospital room and faced the reality of my situation. I couldn't go home and pretend everything was normal. Sarah had already tried to kill me once, and if I went back to my isolated house, she'd almost certainly try again. But I also couldn't let her win by voluntarily giving up my home and my independence. I needed a third option, something that would keep me safe while also protecting what mattered to me. And slowly, an idea began to form. That evening, when Michael came to visit alone, I decided to test a theory. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said," I told him, about the safety concerns, about living alone. What are your thoughts? Mom, he asked, and I could hear the hope in his voice. Maybe you and Sarah are right. Maybe it is time for me to consider other living arrangements. Michael's face lit up with relief. I'm so glad you're being open to this, Mom. I know it's hard, but I really think it's for the best. I'd like to see this Golden Years Manor place that Sarah mentioned. Do you think we could arrange a tour? Absolutely, Michael said quickly. Sarah already spoke to them, and they said they could show us around any time. Would you like me to set something up for next week? Sarah had already spoken to them. Of course she had. She'd probably made arrangements before I'd even woken up. From my coma, had been so confident that her plan would work that she'd started making my funeral arrangements, so to speak. That would be nice, I said. I want to make sure I'm making the right decision. You are, Mom. I know this is scary, but you're going to love it there, and you'll be so much safer. After Michael left, I called my lawyer, Jim Patterson, from the hospital phone. It was late, but Jim had given me his home number years ago and told me to use it if I ever had an emergency. Angela, how are you feeling? He asked when he heard my voice. I heard about your accident. That must have been terrifying. It was, I said, though I didn't elaborate on just how terrifying it had actually been. Jim, I need to ask you about something. If I were to move into a senior living facility, what would happen to my house? Well, that would depend on how you wanted to handle it, he said. You could sell it and use the proceeds to pay for your care. You could rent it out for income. You could hold on to it and just leave it empty. What are you thinking? Michael and Sarah want me to sell it to them, I said. Below market value, as a family arrangement. There was a long pause. Angela, please tell me you're not seriously considering that. I'm trying to understand all my options, I said. What would be the legal implications if I did sell to them? The legal implications would be that you'd be giving them a very expensive gift, Jim said bluntly. That house is worth at least $400,000 in today's market, probably more. If you sell it below market value, you're essentially handing them the difference as a present. $400,000. I'd known the house had appreciated over the years, but hearing the actual number made Sarah's greed even more stark. She wasn't just trying to get me out of my home, she was trying to steal nearly $500,000 from me. What if I don't want to sell? I asked. Then you don't sell, Jim said firmly. Angela, you're not incompetent. You're not under any legal obligation to dispose of your property to make other people happy. That house is yours to do with as you choose. But what if something happens? To me? What if I become unable to make my own decisions? Then whoever you've designated as your power of attorney would make decisions on your behalf. Do you have a power of attorney document? I did. Robert and I had set up our estate planning years ago, and I'd updated it after his death. Michael was my power of attorney, which meant that if I became incapacitated, he would have the legal authority to make decisions about my property and my care. The realization hit me like a cold wave. If Sarah could convince Michael that I was no longer competent to make my own decisions, if she could get doctors to declare me mentally unfit, she could use Michael's power of attorney to force the sale of my house. She wouldn't need my consent. She'd just need my son's signature on the documents. Jim, I said slowly, what would happen if my power of attorney tried to sell my house against my wishes? If you're competent to make your own decisions, your power of attorney can't override your choices, he said. The power of attorney only becomes effective if you're incapacitated. But Angela, why are you asking these questions? Are you worried that Michael might try to force you to sell? I was quiet for a long moment, trying to figure out how to explain my fears without sounding paranoid or delusional. I'm just trying to understand my legal position, I said finally. This accident has made me realize how vulnerable I am, and I want to make sure I'm protected. I think we should meet as soon as you're released from the hospital, Jim said. There are some documents we should review, maybe some changes we should consider to make sure your interests are protected. After I hung up, I lay in the darkness of my hospital room and tried to piece together Sarah's complete plan. She'd tried to kill me, and when that failed, she'd moved to Plan B. Use my accident as justification for moving me into senior care. Once I was isolated in a facility, away from my support systems and my familiar environment, she'd work on convincing everyone that I was becoming mentally incompetent. Then she'd use Michael's power of attorney to sell my house to themselves at below market value. It was a brilliant plan, really. Diabolical, but brilliant. And it might have worked if she hadn't made one crucial error. She'd underestimated my ability to see through her performance. But seeing through her plan and stopping it were two different things. I needed evidence, and I needed allies. Most importantly, I needed to make sure that Sarah didn't get another chance to finish what she'd started. The next morning, I was discharged from the hospital with a list of follow-up appointments and a packet of information about home safety for seniors. Michael and Sarah picked me up, and during the drive home, they kept up a steady stream of conversation about how good it would be for me to get back to familiar surroundings while I decided about my future living arrangements. When we pulled into my driveway, I felt a surge of emotion at seeing my house again. It looked exactly the same. The wraparound porch, the mature trees, the garden that Robert and I had cultivated over decades. But it felt different somehow, tainted by what had happened there, by the knowledge that it had nearly become the scene of my murder. "Let's get you settled," Sarah said, taking my arm as I got out of the car. "You must be exhausted." She was being solicitous, helpful, playing the role of the caring daughter-in-law for Michael's benefit. But I noticed that she maneuvered herself between me and the stairs, as if she were protecting me from another fall. Or perhaps positioning herself for another push. Inside, everything looked normal except for one detail. There was no sign that a serious accident had occurred here just 5 days ago. The kitchen stairs where I'd fallen had been cleaned spotless. Any blood, any evidence of trauma had been completely erased. "We had a cleaning service come in," Michael explained when he saw me looking. "We thought it would be better for you not to see. Well, any reminders of what happened. But I wanted to see reminders. I wanted evidence that what I remembered had actually occurred. The pristine condition of the stairs felt like another layer of Sarah's deception, another way of making me doubt my own memory of events. "That was thoughtful of you," I said, though I was thinking the opposite. "Why don't you rest for a while?" Sarah suggested. "Michael and I can make some lunch, and then maybe we can talk about scheduling that tour of Golden Years Manor." I agreed, partly because I was genuinely tired, but mostly because I wanted them out of my sight while I tried to process being back in the place where Sarah had tried to kill me. As I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling of the room I'd shared with Robert for so many years, I realized that this was my crossroads moment. I could give in to the fear, accept that Sarah had won, and quietly allow myself to be moved into the senior facility where she could continue to manipulate and control my life until she eventually got everything she wanted, or I could fight back. The old Angela, the woman who had deferred to her son's wishes and tried to accommodate his fiancé's demands, might have chosen the path of least resistance. But that woman had died when she hit the bottom of those stairs. The woman who had survived was angrier, smarter, and far more dangerous than Sarah had anticipated. If Sarah wanted to play games with my life, she was about to discover that I'd been playing games a lot longer than she had. And I was much better at them than she realized. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. And that meant doing something I'd never done before, spying on my own son and his fiancée. That afternoon, while they thought I was napping, I quietly made my way to the top of the stairs and listened to their conversation in the kitchen below. What I heard confirmed my worst fears and gave me the information I needed to begin my counterattack. She's agreeing to everything, Sarah was saying, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. The tour, the facility, all of it. I think the accident really shook her up. I'm just glad she's being reasonable about this, Michael replied. I was worried she might dig her heels in and refuse to consider moving. Oh, she would have, Sarah said, and there was something cold in her voice. If she hadn't had her little wake-up call, she would have fought us every step of the way. But sometimes these things have a way of working themselves out. Little wake-up call. That's what she called attempted murder. The important thing is that she's safe now, Michael said. And once she's settled at Golden Years, we can start thinking about what to do with this place. I've already been thinking about that, Sarah said. I found a contractor who can give us an estimate on the renovations we talked about. The kitchen expansion, the master suite addition, updating all the bathrooms. It's going to be expensive, but it'll be worth it to have exactly what we want. They were already planning renovations to my house. My house that I was still living in, that I still owned, that I hadn't agreed to sell. In Sarah's mind, my move to senior living was already a done deal, and my house was already hers to redesign. How much are we talking about? Michael asked. Probably around $60,000 for everything we want to do, Sarah said. But Angela's house is worth at least $400,000, maybe more. Even if we pay her $250,000 for it, we'll still come out way ahead. $250,000. They were planning to pay me roughly 60% of what my house was actually worth, then spend my money on renovations that would benefit only them. The audacity was breathtaking. Do you think she'll agree to that price? Michael asked. She'll agree to whatever we tell her is fair, Sarah said confidently. She trusts you, Michael, and she's not exactly in a position to shop around for better offers. Besides, once she's been in the facility for a few months, once she's gotten used to the routine there, she'll probably be grateful to have the whole house situation resolved. I just want to make sure we're being fair to her, Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. We are being fair, Sarah said firmly. We're taking on the responsibility of dealing with a property that's too much for her to handle. We're saving her the stress and hassle of putting it on the market, and we're keeping it in the family, which is what she wants. $250,000 is more than generous for a family transaction. Generous. She thought stealing nearly $200,000 from me was generous. What if she changes her mind? Michael asked. What if she decides she doesn't want to sell after all? She won't, Sarah said, and her confidence was chilling. Trust me, Michael. Once she's been at Golden Years, for a while, once she realizes how much easier her life is there, she'll wonder why she waited so long to make the move. People adapt. They find ways to be happy with their new circumstances. And if she doesn't adapt? There was a pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice was lower, more careful. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, she said. But I don't think that's going to be an issue. Your mother is a practical woman. She'll do what makes sense. The conversation continued, but I'd heard enough. Sarah had a complete plan for taking over my life, my house, and my financial future. She'd manipulated Michael into believing that what they were doing was in my best interest, and she was confident that once I was isolated in the senior facility, I'd have no choice but to comply with whatever they demanded. But Sarah had made a critical error in her calculations. She'd assumed that I would remain the passive, accommodating woman I'd been before she tried to kill me. She had no idea that pushing me down those stairs had awakened something in me that had been dormant for years, the fierce protectiveness of a woman who refused to be victimized. She wanted my house. She'd have to fight me for it. She wanted my money. She'd have to prove she deserved it. She wanted my son. She'd have to explain to him why she'd tried to murder his mother. But I needed to be smart about this. I needed evidence, allies, and a plan that would protect me while exposing her, and I needed to do it all while pretending to go along with her scheme. That evening, after Michael and Sarah had left, I sat in Robert's old chair and began to plan my counterattack. I had advantages that Sarah didn't know about. I understood her strategy, I knew her timeline, and most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. She thought she'd broken me with that fall down the stairs. Instead, she'd freed me from any obligation to play nice, to be accommodating, to put her comfort above my own survival. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next morning, I woke with a clarity of purpose that I hadn't felt in months. While my body was still healing from Sarah's attack, my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I had work to do, and the clock was ticking. My first order of business was to understand exactly what I was dealing with financially. If Sarah was planning to steal my house and manipulate my assets, I needed to know precisely what those assets were and how they were protected. I called my bank and requested statements for all my accounts, telling them I needed them for tax purposes. Then I called my insurance company to review my homeowner's policy. And finally, I scheduled an appointment with a real estate appraiser to get an updated valuation of my property. Knowledge, I'd learned from Robert during his years in business, was the foundation of any successful strategy. Sarah might think she had all the advantages, but she was operating on assumptions about my finances and legal situation that might not be accurate. While I waited for the paperwork to arrive, I decided to do some investigation of my own. Sarah had been in Michael's life for 3 years, but I realized I knew almost nothing about her background, her family, or her financial situation. If she was so eager to get her hands on my money, what had happened to her own? I started with what Michael had told me about her job. She worked as a marketing director for a tech startup, but which company? In which city? With what kind of salary and benefits? These seemed like basic facts that a concerned mother would know about her future daughter-in-law. But Sarah had always been vague about the details of her professional life. I called Michael that afternoon, trying to sound casual and motherly rather than investigative. "Sweetheart, I was thinking about Sarah's work situation," I said when he answered. "With all this wedding planning and now my health scare, I hope she's not falling behind at her job. What company did you say she works for again?" "Dynamic Digital Solutions," Michael said. "They're based downtown, but Sarah works mostly from home now. She's been with them for about 2 years." "That's wonderful that they're flexible about remote work," I said. "Is it a large company?" "Not huge, maybe 50 employees. It's one of those newer companies that helps businesses with their online presence, social media strategy, that sort of thing." "How exciting for her to be part of a growing industry," I said. "I imagine the pay is quite good in that field." There was a slight pause. "Well, it's a startup, so the salary isn't huge yet, but there's potential for growth. Sarah's really passionate about the work." The pause told me more than his words did. If Sarah was making good money, Michael would have said so. The fact that he was emphasizing potential and passion over actual compensation suggested that her income was probably modest at best. "I'm sure she'll do wonderfully," I said. "These tech companies seem to be the future, don't they?" After we hung up, I had my first piece of useful information. Sarah worked for a small startup with limited resources, which meant her salary was probably not substantial. That raised the question of how she'd been supporting herself before this job and what her financial obligations might be. Over the next few days, I made several more calls, each designed to gather information while sounding like normal conversation. I called Michael's ex-wife, Jennifer, whom I'd always liked and who still exchanged Christmas cards with me. "Angela, how are you feeling?" Jennifer asked when I called. "Michael told me about your accident. That must have been terrifying." "I'm recovering well. Thank you for asking," I said. "Jennifer, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to ask you about something. Have you met Michael's fiancée, Sarah?" "Just once, at a restaurant when Michael and I were meeting about some paperwork," Jennifer said. "She seemed nice enough, though we didn't talk much." "Did Michael mention anything to you about her background? Her family, her previous relationships, anything like that? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. Angela, is everything okay? You sound like you're worried about something. I hadn't intended to be so transparent, but Jennifer had always been perceptive. I'm probably being overly cautious, I said carefully. It's just that she's going to be part of our family, and I realize I don't know much about her history. I understand, Jennifer said. Actually, now that you mention it, there was something that struck me as odd when I met her. She mentioned that she'd been married before, briefly, but when Michael talked about her to me previously, he'd said she'd never been married. This was new information. Sarah had been married before, something she'd apparently hidden from Michael, or at least something he'd chosen not to share with me. Did she say anything else about the previous marriage? Just that it was a mistake, that they were too young, something like that. But Angela, the way she said it felt like there was more to the story, like maybe it hadn't ended well. After talking to Jennifer, I had two significant pieces of information. Sarah's income was probably limited, and she had a previous marriage that she'd been less than honest about. Both suggested someone with financial pressures and a history of concealing important facts, but I needed more than suspicions and secondhand information. I needed documentation, evidence that would hold up if this situation escalated to legal proceedings. And for that, I was going to need professional help. I called a private investigator whose services had been recommended by my lawyer, Jim Patterson. Her name was Maria Santos, and she specialized in background checks and financial investigations. Mrs. Brooks, Jim Patterson spoke very highly of you, Maria said when I called. He mentioned that you might need some assistance with a delicate family matter. I need to know everything I can about my son's fiancée, I said bluntly. Her employment history, her financial situation, any previous marriages or legal troubles, anything that might affect my family's well-being. That's definitely something I can help with, Maria said. What's prompting this request, if you don't mind me asking? I gave her a carefully edited version of events, focusing on Sarah's pressure for me to sell my house and move into senior living, but not mentioning the attempted murder. That was still too explosive, too difficult to prove, and I wasn't ready to make that accusation publicly. I understand your concerns, Maria said. These situations where family members are pressuring elderly relatives to change their living arrangements or dispose of property, unfortunately, I see them more often than I'd like to. Can you give me her full name and any other identifying information you have? I provided what little I knew. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, approximately 38 years old, currently employed by Dynamic Digital Solutions, previously lived in Chicago before moving to our area 3 years ago. I should have preliminary results for you within a week, Maria said. But Mrs. Brooks, I want to be clear about something. If you're feeling pressured or threatened by anyone, even family members, there are legal protections available to you. Elder abuse, including financial exploitation, is a serious crime. I understand, I said. Right now, I just want information. While Maria began her investigation, I focused on documenting everything that was happening in my daily life. I bought a small digital recorder and began keeping an audio diary of conversations, interactions, and observations. If Sarah was planning to eventually claim that I was mentally incompetent, I wanted a record of my mental acuity and clear thinking. I also began researching Golden Years Manor, the senior living facility that Sarah was so eager for me to move into. Their website was impressive, full of photos of smiling elderly people engaged in various activities, descriptions of luxurious accommodations and comprehensive care services. But when I dug deeper, looking at online reviews and state inspection reports, a different picture emerged. Golden Years Manor had been cited multiple times in the past 2 years for staffing shortages, medication errors, and inadequate supervision of residents. Several families had filed complaints about financial irregularities, claiming that the facility had charged for services that weren't provided or had pressured residents to sign over assets to pay for upgraded care packages. Most concerning of all, I found 3 different online reviews from family members who claimed that their elderly relatives had experienced rapid cognitive decline after moving to Golden Years Manor, declining much faster than their previous medical condition would have predicted. The picture that emerged was of a facility that was more interested in extracting money from vulnerable residents than in providing quality care. It was exactly the kind of place where someone like Sarah could count on me becoming increasingly isolated and dependent, increasingly unable to advocate for myself or resist financial manipulation. But why had Sarah chosen this particular facility? There were several other senior living communities in the area with better reputations and comparable costs. What was special about Golden Years Manor that made it perfect for Sarah's plans? I decided to visit the facility myself, posing as a daughter researching options for her aging mother. I called and scheduled a tour, using my maiden name and claiming to live in a neighboring town. Golden Years Manor was located about 20 minutes from my house, tucked away on a quiet road that was far from any major shopping centers or medical facilities. The building itself was attractive enough, a sprawling complex of beige brick and tinted windows that looked like an upscale office building rather than a care facility. The tour was conducted by a woman named Brenda Walsh, who had the kind of aggressive friendliness that immediately put me on guard. She showed me through common areas that were nicely decorated but largely empty, pointing out amenities like the library, the craft room, and the small chapel. "We pride ourselves on creating a real community here," Brenda said as we walked through a dining room where a handful of residents sat alone at separate tables, eating their lunch in silence. "Our residents form lasting friendships and really support each other." The residents I saw looked drugged rather than supported. They moved slowly, responded minimally to Brenda's cheerful greetings, and seemed disconnected from their surroundings, in a way that suggested over-medication rather than contentment. "What kind of medical services do you provide?" I asked. "We have a wonderful medical team," Brenda said. "Dr. Richardson visits twice a week, and we have licensed nurses on staff around the clock. We're also able to help residents manage their medications, which is such a relief for family members who worry about missed doses or dangerous interactions." Manage their medications could mean many things, but given what I'd observed about the residents' apparent lethargy, I suspected it meant keeping people heavily sedated to make them easier to handle. "What about residents who want to maintain some independence?" I asked. "What if someone wants to manage their own medications or come and go as they please?" Brenda's smile became slightly strained. "Well, we've found that residents are generally much happier when they let us take care of the details. Managing medications can be very stressful for people as they age, and we see a real improvement in quality of life when that burden is lifted. But what if a resident insists on maintaining control over their own care?" "We work with families to develop care plans that meet everyone's needs," Brenda said diplomatically. "Sometimes family members need to help residents understand what level of care is really appropriate for their situation." The implication was clear. Residents who insisted on independence would be overruled by their families, with the facility's support. It was exactly the kind of setup that would allow Sarah to gradually strip away my autonomy while claiming it was for my own good. "Can you tell me about your financial arrangements?" I asked. "How do you handle payment for services?" "We offer several different payment options," Brenda said, leading me into her office. "Many of our residents choose to pay annually in advance, which gives them a significant discount and also provides peace of mind for their families. We can also work directly with power of attorney representatives to handle all the financial details." She handed me a packet of information that included rate sheets and contract samples. A quick scan showed that the annual fees were substantial, easily $40,000 to $50,000 per year for a basic apartment and care package. The contract language was dense and complex, filled with clauses about additional fees for specialized services and penalties for early termination. Most telling was a section that outlined the facility's lien rights against residents' assets. If a resident fell behind on payments, Golden Years Manor could claim ownership of personal property, including real estate, to satisfy the debt. "This is quite comprehensive," I said, flipping through the contract. "Do residents typically have lawyers review these agreements before signing?" "Most families find that unnecessary," Brenda said quickly. "Our contracts are very straightforward, and we're always available to answer questions. We find that involving too many outside parties can sometimes complicate what should be a simple process." Of course they did. The last thing a place like Golden Years Manor wanted was competent legal review of their predatory contracts. "I noticed there's a section about asset liens," I said. "Can you explain how that works?" "That's just a standard protection for the facility," Brenda said, her discomfort obvious. "In the unlikely event that there were payment issues, we need to ensure that we can recover the costs of care we've provided. But honestly, that almost never comes up. Most of our residents have their finances well organized before they arrive." I left Golden Years Manor with a clear understanding of Sarah's strategy. She wanted me in a facility that would medicate me into compliance, isolate me from outside support, and position her to take control of my finances through Michael's power of attorney. Once I was there, the complex contracts and lien provisions would make it nearly impossible for me to leave, even if I wanted to. But understanding her plan was only the first step. I still needed evidence of her crimes, and I needed to find a way to protect myself before she could put her strategy into motion. That evening, I received a call from Maria Santos with her preliminary findings about Sarah's background. "Mrs. Brooks, I have some information that I think you'll find very interesting," Maria said. "Sarah Morrison has quite a complicated financial history." "What did you find?" "Let's start with her employment. Dynamic Digital Solutions is indeed a real company, but it's been struggling financially for over a year. They've laid off about half their staff, and according to my sources, they're probably going to close within the next 6 months. Sarah's position was eliminated 2 months ago, though she apparently hasn't told anyone about it." So Sarah was unemployed and had been for 2 months. That explained why she was so desperate to get access to my assets. "What about her previous marriage?" "That's where it gets really interesting," Maria said. "Sarah was married to a man named David Chen from 2018 to 2021. The divorce was contentious and involved allegations of financial fraud. David claimed that Sarah had stolen money from their joint business account and had hidden assets during the divorce proceedings. Was she charged with anything? No formal charges were filed, but the divorce settlement required her to pay significant restitution to David. According to the court records, she was supposed to pay him $50,000 over 2 years. As far as I can tell, she defaulted on those payments almost immediately. So she owes her ex-husband money that she can't pay?" "That's not all," Maria continued. "I found evidence of substantial credit card debt, at least 6 different cards that appear to be maxed out. There are also what look like payday loans, and possibly some private lending arrangements that could be very dangerous if she defaults." The picture was becoming clearer. Sarah wasn't just greedy, she was desperate. She had mounting debts, no income, and creditors who were probably becoming increasingly aggressive about collection. "How much total debt are we talking about?" I asked. It's hard to get exact figures without access to her financial records, but based on what I can see, she's probably looking at somewhere between $150,000 to $200,000 in total obligations. $200,000. Almost exactly the amount she'd planned to steal from me by buying my house below market value. "Is there anything else I should know?" "Actually, yes," Maria said. "I found something that might be relevant to your current situation. Sarah was briefly engaged to someone else between her divorce and meeting your son. A man named Robert Martinez, a widower in his 70s who owned several rental properties. My blood went cold. What happened to that engagement? It ended abruptly after about 6 months. Robert Martinez filed a restraining order against Sarah, claiming that she had threatened him when he refused to loan her money. According to the police report, she had been pressuring him to add her name to the deeds of his rental properties. So I wasn't Sarah's first elderly target. She had a pattern of pursuing older people with valuable assets, gaining their trust or their family's trust, and then trying to manipulate them into signing over property. "Mrs. Brooks, I have to ask," Maria said. "Has Sarah made any threats? Against you? Have you felt physically unsafe around her?" I hesitated. I hadn't told anyone about what really happened the night I fell down the stairs, partly because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, and partly because I wasn't ready to make that accusation without more evidence. "She's been very pushy about wanting me to move into senior living," I said carefully. "And there have been some veiled threats about what might happen if I don't cooperate." "I understand your caution about making serious accusations," Maria said. "But based on what I'm seeing in her background, Sarah Morrison is someone who escalates her tactics when she doesn't get what she wants. If you feel threatened, even slightly, you should consider involving law enforcement." After talking to Maria, I sat in my kitchen staring at the stairs where Sarah had pushed me and tried to process what I'd learned. She wasn't just a greedy woman looking for an easy payday. She was someone with a history of targeting vulnerable older people, someone with massive debts and no legitimate way to pay them, someone whose previous relationship had ended with a restraining order for threats. I was dealing with a predator, someone who had identified me as prey, and was systematically working to trap me in a situation where she could drain my assets while keeping me too isolated and medicated to resist. But knowledge was power, and I now had enough information to begin fighting back. The question was how to use what I'd learned without putting myself in even greater danger. The next morning, Michael called to tell me that he'd scheduled the tour of Golden Years Manor for the following afternoon. "Sarah's really excited to show you around," he said. "She thinks you're going to love it there." "I'm sure I will," I said, though my skin crawled at the thought of going back to that place with Sarah, knowing what I now knew about her plans and her history. "And Mom, I wanted to talk to you about the house," Michael continued. "Sarah and I have been thinking that it might be good to get the process started, with getting it appraised and thinking about what a fair price would be." "That's very thoughtful of you both," I said, though I was thinking that they could think about it all they wanted. They weren't getting my house for any price, fair or otherwise. "We want to make sure everything is handled properly," Michael said. "Sarah suggested that we might want to use her real estate agent, someone who specializes in these kinds of family transactions." Of course she did. Sarah would want to control every aspect of the sale, including having her own agent who would support whatever valuation served her interests rather than mine. "I appreciate you thinking ahead," I said. "Why don't we wait until after I've seen the facility? I want to make sure I'm making the right decision about moving before we start making plans for the house." "That makes sense," Michael agreed. "But Mom, I hope you understand that this really is the best thing for everyone. You'll be safer, we'll have peace of mind, and you won't have to worry about maintaining that big house anymore." The way he said it made it clear that the decision had already been made in his mind. My tour of Golden Years Manor was just a formality, a way to make me feel like I had some input in a process that was actually beyond my control. But Michael was wrong about one crucial thing. The decision wasn't his to make. It was mine, and I had no intention of making the choice that Sarah was expecting. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, Jim Patterson, and asked him to meet me at his office as soon as possible. "Jim, I need to make some changes to my legal documents," I said when we sat down in his conference room. "And I need to do it today." "What kind of changes are you thinking about?" "I want to revoke Michael's power of attorney," I said, "and I want to create a new will that makes it very clear what my intentions are regarding my house and my other assets." Jim leaned back in his chair, studying my face. Angela, that's a significant step. Can you tell me what's prompted this decision? I told him everything. About Sarah's threats, about her financial history that Maria had uncovered, about the conversation I'd overheard where they discussed buying my house for far below market value. I even told him about my suspicions regarding what had really happened the night I fell down the stairs, though I acknowledged that I couldn't prove it. When I finished, Jim was quiet for a long moment. Angela, what you're describing sounds like a systematic attempt to exploit you financially, he said finally. The pressure tactics, the isolation, the attempts to rush you into decisions about your property. These are all classic warning signs of elder abuse. What can I do to protect myself? Well, revoking the power of attorney is a good start, Jim said. We can create a new document that designates someone else, or we can set up a more complex arrangement that requires multiple people to agree before any major decisions can be made about your assets. What about my will? We can absolutely update your will to make your intentions crystal clear. We can also create what's called a living trust, which would make it much harder for anyone to challenge your decisions about your property after your death. And what about while I'm alive? What if they try to have me declared mentally incompetent? That's much harder to do than most people realize, Jim said. You'd have to be evaluated by medical professionals, and there would be a court hearing where you'd have the right to legal representation. But Angela, if you're genuinely concerned about your physical safety, we should discuss involving law, enforcement. I'm not ready for that yet, I said, but I want to make sure I'm protected legally. We spent the next 2 hours revising my documents. I revoked Michael's power of attorney and created a new arrangement that required both Jim and my sister Helen to agree before any major financial decisions could be made on my behalf. I updated my will to leave my house to a charity rather than to Michael, with a provision that explicitly stated this decision was made due to pressure and threats from his fiancée. And I created a living trust that would make it virtually impossible for anyone to challenge my intentions. There's one more thing I'd recommend, Jim said as we finished. I think you should consider installing a security system in your house. Cameras, alarms, something that would document any threats or aggressive behavior. That's a good idea, I said. Can you recommend someone? I have a client who runs a security company. I'll give him a call and ask him to contact you today. As I left Jim's office, I felt more prepared for the battle that was coming. Sarah might think she had all the advantages, but she'd underestimated how determined I could be when someone threatened everything I cared about. But I also knew that revising my legal documents was only the first step. Sarah had already shown that she was willing to use violence to get what she wanted. Now that her financial situation was becoming even more desperate, there was no telling how far she might be willing to go. The security company Jim recommended was able to install cameras and an alarm system that very evening. The technician, a professional woman named Lisa, was sympathetic when I explained that I was concerned about my safety. We see this more than you might think, she said, as she positioned cameras in my kitchen and living room. Family members who become threatening when elderly relatives won't cooperate with their plans. The good news is that once people know they're being recorded, they usually modify their behavior pretty quickly. What if they don't? Then you have evidence, Lisa said simply. Evidence that can be used for restraining orders, criminal charges, whatever legal protection you need. That night, as I lay in bed in my house that was now monitored by security cameras, I felt more secure than I had since the night Sarah pushed me down the stairs. I had legal protection, financial protection, and physical security measures in place. But I also knew that the real test was coming tomorrow, when I would have to tour Golden Years Manor with Sarah and pretend that I was seriously considering moving there. I would have to act like the confused, frightened old woman she expected me to be while actually gathering more information about her plans. It was going to be the performance of my life, and if I did it right, it might be the beginning of the end for Sarah Morrison. The morning of the Golden Years Manor tour arrived gray and drizzling, which seemed fitting for what I was about to endure. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me look frail and uncertain rather than determined and sharp. Sarah needed to believe that I was the confused, easily manipulated woman she expected, not the woman who had spent the last week systematically dismantling her plans. Michael arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, looking nervous in the way he had as a child when he was about to do something he knew was wrong, but felt pressured to do anyway. Sarah was with him, of course, dressed in a crisp navy suit that made her look professional and trustworthy. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was dressed like someone you'd want managing your affairs, when in reality she was someone you'd want to keep as far from your money as possible. "Mom, you look nice," Michael said, though his voice carried the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. "Are you ready for this?" "I think so," I said, letting a slight tremor creep into my voice. "I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about such a big change." "That's completely natural," Sarah said, taking my arm in what appeared to be a supportive gesture but felt more like a claim of ownership. Change is always scary, but sometimes it's exactly what we need to improve our quality of life. As we drove to the facility, Sarah kept up a steady stream of conversation about how wonderful Golden Years Manor was, how much I was going to love the community atmosphere, how relieved Michael and she would be to know I was safe and well cared for. I made appropriate murmuring sounds of interest while mentally recording every word for the audio diary I'd been keeping. When we arrived at Golden Years Manor, Brenda Walsh was waiting for us with the same aggressive smile she'd worn during my previous visit. I was careful to show no sign of recognition, playing the role of someone seeing the place for the first time. "Mrs. Brooks, welcome to Golden Years Manor," Brenda said, extending her hand. "Sarah has told me so much about you. I'm excited to show you everything we have to offer." The tour began the same way it had before, with Brenda leading us through the common areas while delivering her practice spiel about community and care. But this time, I was watching Sarah as much as I was listening to Brenda, and what I saw was fascinating. Sarah wasn't just familiar with the facility. She was familiar with specific details that suggested she'd been here multiple times, possibly for extended periods. She knew which elevator was faster, which bathroom was closest to the dining room, which hallway led to the administrative offices. When Brenda mentioned the craft room, Sarah nodded toward a door before Brenda had pointed it out. More telling was the way some of the staff members reacted to seeing her. A nurse walking past us did a double-take when she saw Sarah, then quickly looked away. An aide wheeling an elderly man down the hallway actually stopped and stared until Sarah noticed, and the aide hurried away. Sarah had been here before, and recently. The question was why. "Now, let me show you one of our lovely apartments," Brenda said, leading us toward the residential wing. "This one just became available, and I think it would be perfect for you, Mrs. Brooks." The apartment was clean and adequately furnished, but it felt more like a hotel room than a home. Everything was designed for easy cleaning and safety, rather than comfort or personality. The windows were large but looked out onto the parking lot rather than any kind of garden or natural scenery. "Isn't this nice, Mom?" Michael said, though his enthusiasm sounded forced. "Look how convenient everything is. The kitchenette is perfect for light meals, and the bathroom has all those safety features." "It's very practical," I agreed, though what I was really thinking was how depressing it would be to spend my final years in such a sterile environment. "The best part is how secure everything is," Sarah added. "You'll never have to worry about break-ins or wandering outside when you're not thinking clearly. The staff keeps track of everyone, so your family always knows you're safe." The way she phrased it made it sound like a prison rather than a home. Not thinking clearly suggested that residents were expected to develop cognitive problems, and keeping track of everyone implied a level of surveillance that would make independent living impossible. "What happens if a resident wants to leave the facility?" I asked, say to visit family or go shopping? Well, that depends on their care level, Brenda said carefully. For residents who are still fully independent, we certainly don't restrict their movements. But for residents who might be confused or unsafe on their own, we work with their families to determine what level of supervision is appropriate. Who determines whether someone is confused or unsafe? I pressed. Our medical staff evaluates each resident regularly, Brenda said. Dr. Richardson is wonderful at assessing cognitive function and making recommendations about appropriate care levels. I filed that away as important information. Dr. Richardson, whoever he was, apparently had the power to declare residents incompetent and restrict their freedom of movement. It would be interesting to know what his qualifications were and what his relationship with the facility's financial interests might be. Can we see the medical facilities? I asked. Of course, Brenda said, though she seemed less enthusiastic about this part of the tour. The medical wing was smaller than I'd expected, with only 2 examination rooms and a medication storage area that looked more like a pharmacy than a simple supply closet. The quantity of medications on hand suggested that residents were being heavily medicated, possibly unnecessarily so. We pride ourselves on our medication management program, Brenda explained as we walked through. So many of our residents come to us with complex medication regimens that are difficult to manage at home. We take over all of that responsibility, making sure everyone gets exactly what they need when they need it. What if a resident wants to continue managing their own medications? I asked. We've found that residents are much happier when they don't have to worry about such things, Brenda said, echoing what she'd told me during my previous visit. The stress of managing multiple medications can be overwhelming for people as they age. But surely some residents are still capable of managing their own care? Dr. Richardson evaluates each case individually, Brenda said firmly. He's very good at determining what level of care is most appropriate for each resident's situation. There was Dr. Richardson again. I was beginning to understand that he was the key to the facility's control over its residents. If he could be convinced to declare someone incompetent, they would lose the right to make their own decisions about medication, movement, or any other aspect of their care. As we continued the tour, I noticed something else interesting. Sarah kept steering the conversation toward financial topics. She asked about payment schedules, insurance coverage, and what happened if a resident's financial situation changed. When Brenda mentioned the facility's lien rights, Sarah asked for specific details about how those worked and how quickly they could be exercised. It's so important to have these financial protections in place, Sarah said to me after Brenda had explained the lien process. You wouldn't want to worry about money issues after you've settled in here. The way she said it made it sound like she was looking out for my interests. But I knew better. She was learning exactly how quickly the facility could seize my assets once I was trapped here. Sarah's absolutely right, Brenda agreed. We find that residents are much more comfortable when they know their financial obligations are secured. That's why many of our residents choose to sign over power of attorney to trusted family members who can handle all the business details. Power of attorney. There it was again. The legal tool that would give Sarah control over my finances once Michael signed the documents. Between Dr. Richardson's ability to declare me incompetent and the facility's lien rights, they had created a perfect system for transferring wealth from vulnerable residents to the facility and their families. What percentage of your residents have family members managing their finances? I asked. Oh, I'd say about 80%, Brenda said. It's really the most practical arrangement for everyone involved. 80%. That meant the vast majority of residents had been stripped of financial autonomy, either through family pressure or medical declarations of incompetence. As we concluded the tour, Brenda led us back to her office to discuss next steps. The packet of information she gave me was different from the one I'd received during my solo visit, with several additional forms that I hadn't seen before. These are just preliminary documents, Brenda explained. Nothing binding, of course. but they help us get the process started if you decide Golden Years Manor is right for you. I flipped through the forms, recognizing several that were designed to gather detailed financial information, bank account numbers, property ownership details, insurance policies, investment accounts. There was also a medical release form that would give the facility access to all my health records, and a document that looked suspiciously like a preliminary power of attorney transfer. "This is quite comprehensive," I said. "We like to be thorough," Brenda said. "The more information we have up front, the smoother the transition process. When would you need these completed?" "Well, that apartment I showed you is quite popular," Brenda said. "If you're interested in it, I'd recommend getting your application in as soon as possible. We do have a waiting list." The pressure was subtle, but unmistakable. Act quickly or lose this wonderful opportunity. It was classic high-pressure sales tactics, designed to prevent potential residents from having time to think carefully about their decision or seek outside advice. "I understand," I said. "Can I take these home to review them?" "Of course," Brenda said, though her smile faltered slightly. "But as I mentioned, that particular apartment won't be available indefinitely." As we drove home, Sarah was practically vibrating with excitement. "Wasn't that wonderful, Angela?" she gushed. "I can just picture you there, making new friends, participating in all those activities. And the peace of mind for Michael and me, knowing you're safe and well cared for." "It certainly seems like a very secure facility," I said carefully. "Exactly," Sarah said. "Security is so important at your age. You need to be somewhere that people are looking out for you, making sure you're taking your medications properly, making sure you're not making any decisions that might not be in your best interest." There it was, stated more clearly than ever. Sarah wanted me somewhere that other people would make decisions for me, where I would have no control over my own life or assets. "When do you think you'd like to move in?" Michael asked. "I mean, if you decide it's right for you." "Well, Brenda made it sound like I shouldn't wait too long if I want that particular apartment," I said. "She's absolutely right," Sarah said, quickly. "Places like Golden Years Manor have long waiting lists. If you're serious about this, we should probably get your application in this week." This week. She wanted to have me committed to the facility within days, before I had time. "To change my mind or seek outside advice? That does seem fast," I said. "Don't I need to sell my house first? Figure out the financial arrangements?" "Actually, that's not necessary," Sarah said, and I could hear the calculation in her voice. "The facility works with families to handle all those details. You could move in immediately and sort out the property sale afterward." "But how would I pay for the facility if I haven't sold the house yet?" "Michael and I could help with the initial payments," Sarah said. "As a family. Loan, of course. Then when the house sells, you could pay us back and have money left over for your care." It was brilliantly conceived. They would pay for my initial stay at Golden Years Manor, which would give them even more leverage to pressure me into selling my house quickly and at below market value. I'd be trapped in the facility, dependent on their financial support, with no choice but to accept whatever terms they offered for my property. "That's very generous of you both," I said. "It's what families do for each other," Sarah said. "We take care of each other." When we arrived back at my house, I invited them in for coffee, partly to maintain the pretense of being a grateful future resident, but mostly because I wanted to test something. As Sarah and Michael sat at my kitchen table discussing the details of when I might move to Golden Years Manor, I excused myself to use the bathroom. Instead, I went to the small office where I'd hidden the audio recorder that was documenting our conversation. But I also activated the new security cameras that had been installed, making sure they were recording everything that happened in my kitchen. When I returned to the table, Sarah was examining the forms from Golden Years Manor. "You know, Angela, it might make sense to get started on some of this paperwork tonight," she said. especially the financial disclosure forms. That way, if you decide to proceed, we won't lose any time. I suppose that makes sense, I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me not to put my financial information in Sarah's hands. I could help you fill them out, Sarah offered. Some of these questions can be confusing, and I want to make sure everything is accurate. Of course she wanted to help. She wanted to see exactly what assets I had, which accounts contained the most money, and how those assets were currently protected. That's thoughtful of you, I said. But I think I'd prefer to review them with my lawyer first. These are pretty important documents. Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Is that really necessary? They're just informational forms. I'm sure they are, I said. But Robert always taught me never to sign anything financial without having a lawyer review it first. It's just a habit. Of course, Sarah said, though her voice had gone cold. That's very prudent of you. The word prudent came out, like she was saying stupid or difficult. It was clear that involving my lawyer was not part of her preferred timeline. When do you think you might be able to meet with your lawyer? Michael asked. I'll call him tomorrow, I said. Maybe we can schedule something for later this week. The thing is, Mom, that apartment at Golden Years Manor really might not be available much longer, Michael said. Maybe we could at least get the basic information filled out tonight and then have your lawyer review it later? The pressure was intensifying. Both Michael and Sarah were pushing for me to complete the financial disclosure forms immediately, before I had a chance to seek outside advice or reconsider my decision. I understand your concern about the apartment, I said, but I'd really feel more comfortable having professional guidance on these forms. Some of the language is quite technical. What if we called your lawyer now? Sarah suggested. Maybe he could walk you through the forms over the phone? It was 8 o'clock in the evening. No reasonable person would expect a lawyer to be available for a phone consultation at that hour about non-emergency paperwork. Sarah's suggestion revealed how desperate she was to get her hands on my financial information. I don't think Jim would appreciate being called at home about something that isn't urgent, I said. But this is urgent, Sarah said, her mask slipping slightly. If you want that apartment, if you want to be settled somewhere safe, we need to move quickly. Sarah's right, Mom, Michael said. This is important. Your safety is more important than worrying about inconveniencing your lawyer. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and saw that he had become a stranger to me. The Michael I knew would never pressure his mother into making major life decisions without proper consideration and professional advice. The Michael sitting at my table was someone else entirely, someone who had been so thoroughly manipulated by Sarah that he was willing to participate in what amounted to elder abuse. I appreciate your concern, I said firmly, but I'm not comfortable rushing into such an important decision. I'll call Jim tomorrow, review the documents properly, and then decide how to proceed. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: frustration, anger, calculation, and finally, false acceptance. Of course, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You should take all the time you need. We just want what's best. For you. But I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was already planning her next move, already figuring out how to overcome my resistance to her timeline. After they left, I sat in my kitchen reviewing what had just happened. Sarah's behavior during the tour had revealed that she was much more familiar with Golden Years Manor than she'd let on. Her eagerness to get me to fill out financial disclosure forms immediately, without legal review, showed how desperate she was to access my assets. And her reaction to my insistence on involving my lawyer revealed that she knew her plan wouldn't withstand professional scrutiny. But I'd also learned something else important. Time was becoming critical for Sarah. Her unemployment, her mounting debts, and her creditors were creating pressure that was making her increasingly reckless. The more desperate she became, the more likely she was to make mistakes that would expose her completely. I called Maria Santos, my private investigator, to update her on what I'd observed during the tour. Mrs. Brooks, what you're describing sounds like Sarah has been planning this for quite a while, Maria said after I'd recounted the day's events. Her familiarity with the facility suggests she's been there multiple times, possibly researching it as part of her scheme. Is there any way to find out how long she's been in contact with them? I can try to get visitor logs, though that might be difficult without a legal subpoena, Maria said. But there's something else I want to tell you. I've been digging deeper into Sarah's financial situation, and what I found is alarming. What did you discover? She's not just in debt to credit card companies and her ex-husband, Maria said. There are indications that she's borrowed money from some very dangerous people. Private lenders who don't go through traditional collection processes. My blood went cold. What kind of people? The kind who break bones when they don't get paid back, Maria said bluntly. Mrs. Brooks, I think Sarah may be in physical danger from her creditors, which makes her exponentially more dangerous to you. When people are facing that kind of pressure, they're capable of anything. How much time do you think she has before her creditors become violent? Based on the pattern of her borrowing and the amounts involved, probably not long. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a month at the outside. A few weeks. That meant Sarah's timeline wasn't just about getting me into Golden Years Manor quickly, it was about accessing my assets before her creditors decided to take more direct action against her. Maria, I need to ask you something, I said. If Sarah were to die, would her debts transfer to Michael after they're married? Generally, no, unless he co-signed for the debts or they acquired them jointly after marriage. But Mrs. Brooks, are you thinking that Sarah might be planning to fake her own death or disappear? I hadn't been thinking that, but now that Maria mentioned it, it made sense. If Sarah could get access to my assets, pay off her most dangerous creditors and then disappear, she could escape both her financial problems and any legal consequences for what she'd done to me. Is that something people actually do? More often than you'd think, Maria said, especially when they're facing violent creditors and have access to enough money to start over somewhere else. After talking to Maria, I realized that I'd been thinking too small about Sarah's plan. I'd assumed she wanted to steal my house and force me into senior care as a way to support her lifestyle with Michael. But what if her real plan was to take my money and run, leaving Michael behind to deal with the aftermath? That night I barely slept. Every sound in the house made me wonder if Sarah had decided that waiting for my voluntary cooperation was taking too long. I kept the security system armed and my phone within reach, but I knew that if she was truly desperate enough, a security system might not be enough to protect me. The next morning, I called Jim Patterson as soon as his office opened. "Jim, I need to see you today," I said. "Something happened yesterday that makes me think Sarah is planning to accelerate her timeline." "What kind of something?" I told him about the tour, about Sarah's pressure to complete financial disclosure forms immediately, about her familiarity with the facility that suggested prior planning. "Angela, what you're describing sounds like someone who's preparing to commit a significant financial crime," Jim said. "I think it's time we involved law enforcement." What would I tell them? That my son's fiancé wants me to move into senior care and sell my house. You'd tell them about the threats, about the pressure tactics, about her attempts to rush you into signing financial documents without legal review, Jim said. And most importantly, you'd tell them about your suspicions regarding what really happened the night you fell down the stairs. I took a deep breath. I'd been avoiding making that accusation because I knew how difficult it would be to prove, and because I was afraid it would destroy my relationship with Michael permanently. But I was beginning to understand that my relationship with Michael was already destroyed, corrupted by Sarah's manipulation to the point where he was actively participating in what amounted to a conspiracy against me. "All right," I said. "Let's involve the police." "I'll make some calls and set up a meeting," Jim said. "In the meantime, I want you to be very careful. Don't be alone with Sarah under any circumstances, and don't sign anything, no matter how much pressure they put on you. What if they try to have me declared mentally incompetent? That's a lengthy legal process that requires medical evaluation and court hearings, Jim said. As long as you have competent legal representation, it's very difficult to have someone declared incompetent against their will. But Angela, if Sarah is as desperate as you think she is, she might try more direct methods. More direct methods, like pushing me down the stairs again, except this time making sure I didn't survive. I spent the rest of the morning organizing documents and evidence, the audio recordings I'd been making, the financial information Maria had gathered about Sarah, the security camera footage from our conversation in my kitchen. If I was going to accuse Sarah of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, I wanted to make sure I had everything the police would need to take my claims seriously. At 2:00, I met with Detective Raymond Mills, AIC, veteran investigator who specialized in crimes against elderly victims. Jim had arranged the meeting, and we sat in his conference room while I laid out everything I knew about Sarah's background, her financial desperation, and her systematic campaign to gain control of my assets. Mrs. Brooks, what you're describing is a pattern we see unfortunately often, Detective Mills said after I'd finished. Younger people who target elderly individuals with valuable assets, gain their trust or their family's trust, and then manipulate them into signing over property or moving into controlled environments. What can be done about it? That depends on what crimes we can prove, Detective Mills said. The pressure tactics you've described could constitute elder abuse, depending on how explicit the threats were. The attempt to rush you into signing financial documents without legal review could be attempted fraud. And if your suspicions about being pushed down the stairs are correct, we're talking about attempted murder. But can any of it be proven? Let's start with what we have, Detective Mills said. You mentioned that you've been recording conversations. Can I hear some of those? I played several of the recordings I'd made, including the conversation from the previous evening where Sarah had pressured me to complete financial forms immediately. Detective Mills listened carefully, occasionally asking me to replay certain sections. These recordings are helpful, he said when I'd finished. They establish a pattern of financial pressure and manipulation. But I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Brooks. It's going to be difficult to prove criminal intent based on what we have so far. What would it take to prove criminal intent? We'd need evidence that Sarah made explicit threats, or that she attempted to forge documents, or that she tried to access your accounts without authorization, Detective Mills said. The strongest case would be if we could get her to make incriminating statements that clearly demonstrate criminal intent. How would we do that? Detective Mills and Jim exchanged a look. Mrs. Brooks, what I'm about to suggest involves some risk, Detective Mills said. But if you're willing, we could set up a controlled situation where you're equipped with recording devices and Sarah is encouraged to be more explicit about her plans. You mean like a sting operation? Something like that, Detective Mills said. You'd meet with Sarah in a controlled environment, we'd have surveillance equipment running, and you'd steer the conversation toward topics that might cause her to reveal her true intentions. The idea of deliberately provoking Sarah into revealing her criminal plans was terrifying, but it might be the only way to gather enough evidence to stop her before she escalated to more direct violence. What kind of risks are we talking about? I asked. The main risk is that if Sarah suspects what you're doing, she might become aggressive or violent, Detective Mills said. We'd have officers nearby, but there would still be some danger involved. And if I don't do this, then we wait and hope that Sarah commits a crime that leaves more obvious evidence, Detective Mills said. But based on what you've told me about her financial situation and her timeline, I'm not sure we have the luxury of waiting. I thought about my options. I could continue living in fear, waiting for Sarah to make her next move and hoping I'd be able to survive it. I could give in to her demands and spend my remaining years as a prisoner in Golden Years Manor while she systematically drained my assets. Or I could take the offensive, gather the evidence needed to stop her, and reclaim control over my own life. When I thought about it that way, there was really only one choice. What would I need to do? Detective Mills outlined the plan with the precision of someone who had orchestrated these operations many times before. I would invite Sarah over to discuss the Golden Years Manor paperwork, claiming I'd had second thoughts about involving my lawyer and was ready to proceed immediately. The urgency would appeal to her desperation, while giving us the opportunity to record her making incriminating statements about her true intentions. The meeting was scheduled for the following evening. Detective Mills and his team would be positioned outside my house with surveillance equipment, ready to intervene if Sarah became violent. I would wear a wire, and the security cameras I'd already installed would provide backup recording. Remember, Mrs. Brooks, the goal is to get her talking about specifics, Detective Mills had instructed. We need her to admit to planning financial fraud, to acknowledge her debts and desperation, and ideally, to make some reference to what really happened the night you fell. As 6 o'clock approached, I found myself surprisingly calm. Perhaps it was because I finally felt like I was taking control of my situation instead of simply reacting to Sarah's machinations. Or perhaps it was because I knew that within a few hours, this nightmare would finally be over, one way or another. Sarah arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. She thought she was finally going to get what she'd been working toward for months. "Angela, I'm so glad you called," she said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table. "I was worried that your lawyer might try to complicate things unnecessarily." "I realized you were right about not wanting to lose that apartment," I said, playing my role carefully. "Sometimes lawyers just slow things down when what you really need is to act quickly." "Exactly," Sarah said, pulling out the Golden Years Manor paperwork. These forms are really very straightforward. Most of it is just basic information about your assets and income. As we began working through the forms, I steered the conversation toward topics that would reveal Sarah's true motivations. "I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about the financial aspects," I said. "This is such a big change, and these costs are quite substantial." "That's why it's so important to get everything organized properly," Sarah said. "The facility needs to understand your complete financial picture so they can structure the payment plan appropriately. What happens if I run out of money? What if the costs are higher than expected?" Sarah's eyes lit up in a way that was genuinely chilling. "Well, that's where the family support comes in. Michael and I would never let you struggle financially. We'd make sure you have everything you need." "That's very generous, but I wouldn't want to be a burden." "You wouldn't be a burden," Sarah said, leaning forward intently. "Look, Angela, let's be honest about something. You have assets that aren't really doing you any good just sitting there. That big house, for instance. You can't maintain it properly anymore, and it's just going to become more of a liability as you get older." "I suppose you're right. What would you suggest?" "The smartest thing would be to sell it as soon as possible, while the market is still strong," Sarah said. "Michael and I have been talking about it, and we'd be willing to take it off your hands at a fair price. That way, you'd have immediate cash for your care costs, and we'd handle all the hassle of dealing with real estate agents and inspections and all that complicated stuff." "What would you consider a fair price?" "Well, obviously, it would need to be below market value since we'd be taking it as is, without repairs or improvements," Sarah said. "We were thinking somewhere around $250,000, maybe $275 if the inspection comes back clean. $250,000 for a house worth over $400,000. She was planning to steal nearly $200,000 from me and calling it a family favor. That seems like quite a discount from what I thought the house was worth." "Angela, you have to be realistic," Sarah said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Houses that need work don't sell for full market value. And besides, this way you avoid all the costs and delays of putting it on the open market. You get cash immediately, we get a property we can fix up, and everyone wins. I see. And what about my other assets? My savings accounts? My investments? Well, once you're at Golden Years Manor, you really won't need much cash, Sarah said. The facility handles everything for you. It might make sense to consolidate your accounts. Maybe have Michael manage them for you so you don't have to worry about all those financial details. There it was. She wanted control of my house and my bank accounts, leaving me completely dependent on her and Michael for everything. That sounds very convenient, I said. But what if something happens to Michael? What if something happens to you? Who would manage my affairs then? Sarah's expression flickered for just a moment, and I saw something calculating and cold. Nothing's going to happen to us, Angela, she said. We're young and healthy. But if something did happen, the facility would make sure you're taken care of. That's what you're paying for. I suppose. It's just that this is all happening so fast. A few months ago, I was living independently in my own home, and now you're making smart decisions about your future, instead of clinging to a past that isn't sustainable. Sarah interrupted. Angela, I'm going to be direct with you because I care about you. You had a serious fall. You could have died. If I hadn't found you when I did, you might have laid there for days before anyone discovered you. If she hadn't found me? The phrase was fascinating, considering that she was the one who had pushed me. That's true, I said carefully. I'm grateful that you came by when you did. But here's the thing, Sarah continued, leaning forward with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. What if next time there's no one there to find you? What if you fall again, or have a medical emergency, or just become confused and do something dangerous? At your age, living alone is basically a suicide risk. You really think I'm in that much danger? I think you're in more danger than you realize, Sarah said. And there was something in her voice that sounded like a threat. Accidents happen, especially to elderly people who are stubborn about accepting help. Sometimes it takes a real tragedy to make people understand that they need to make changes. The recording device hidden in my clothing was capturing every word, and I knew the surveillance team outside was hearing everything through their equipment. What kind of tragedy? I asked. Oh, you know, Sarah said with false casualness. Kitchen fires from forgotten burners. Falls downstairs that are more serious than the first one. Medical emergencies that go unnoticed because there's no one around to call for help. The statistics for elderly people living alone are really quite frightening. She was describing exactly how she could kill me and make it look accidental. More importantly, she was making it clear that she'd already thought through multiple scenarios for eliminating me if I didn't cooperate with her plans. That is frightening, I said. I suppose I really should be taking this more seriously. You absolutely should, Sarah said. And that's why we need to get these forms completed tonight and get you moved into Golden Years Manor as soon as possible. Every day you stay in this house is another day you're risking something terrible happening. You're right. Let me get my financial documents so we can complete these forms properly. I excused myself to get the papers from my desk, but what I was really doing was giving Detective Mills's team the signal we'd arranged. When I returned to the kitchen, Sarah was on her phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. No, I told you. It's going to be soon, she was saying. A few more days, maybe a week at the outside. Yes, I understand the timeline. Yes, I know what happens if I don't deliver. She hung up quickly when she saw me returning. Sorry about that, she said. Just work stuff. But I'd heard enough to understand that she wasn't just desperate for my money. She was being threatened by her creditors. The timeline she'd mentioned matched what Maria had told me about how long she had before her violent lenders lost patience. No problem, I said, sitting back down. Now, where were we? As we continued working through the paperwork, Sarah became increasingly aggressive about getting me to sign documents immediately, rather than reviewing them carefully. "This is just a preliminary application," she said when I hesitated over a form that would give Golden Years Manor access to my bank accounts. "It doesn't commit you to anything. But it does ask for my account numbers and balances. That's standard information," Sarah said impatiently. "They need to verify that you can afford their services." "I understand, but these numbers are quite personal. What if someone at the facility misused this information?" "Angela, you're being paranoid," Sarah snapped, her facade of patience finally cracking. "These people are professionals. They're not going to steal your money." "I'm not worried about them stealing it," I said quietly. "I'm worried about someone else using this information to access my accounts." Sarah went very still. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that once my financial information is in writing, anyone who has access to these forms could potentially use it for purposes I didn't intend." "Like who?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously low. "Like family members who might be experiencing financial difficulties." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Sarah stared at me across the table, and I could see her calculating whether I knew about her debts, her desperation, her plans for my money. "What exactly are you implying, Angela?" "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm just being cautious about protecting my assets." "Your assets?" Sarah repeated, and now her mask was completely gone. "You mean the assets you're going to lose? Anyway, when you can't take care of yourself anymore? The house that's going to sit empty and deteriorate? The money that's going to be eaten up by medical costs and facility fees?" "I hope that's not what happens." "It's exactly what's going to happen," Sarah said, standing up abruptly. "Whether you cooperate or not. The only difference is whether your family benefits from the situation or whether it all goes to strangers." "And by family, you mean you and Michael?" "I mean the people who actually care about you," Sarah said. "The people who are trying to help you make smart decisions instead of clinging to illusions about independence that stopped being realistic years ago." "I see. And what happens if I decide I don't want your help?" Sarah leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table, her face inches from mine. "Then you'll learn what it's like to be truly alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No family support, no one checking on you, no one caring whether you live or die. And at your age, in your condition, that isolation won't last very long." "Are you threatening me, Sarah?" "I'm stating a fact," she said. "Accidents happen to elderly people who refuse to accept help. Sometimes they happen more than once. Sometimes they happen to people who should have learned their lesson the first time." And there it was, a clear admission that she'd been responsible for my fall, and a direct threat that she'd do it again if I didn't comply with her demands. "Like what happened to me a few weeks ago." Sarah smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. "Exactly like what happened to you a few weeks ago," she said. "Except next time, there might not be anyone around to call for help." The front door burst open at that moment, and Detective Mills and 2 other officers rushed into my kitchen with their weapons drawn. "Police, put your hands where we can see them." Sarah spun around, her face going white with shock and fury. "What is this?" she demanded. "Sarah Morrison, you're under arrest for attempted murder, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud," Detective Mills said as one of the officers moved to handcuff her. "This is ridiculous," Sarah protested. "I haven't done anything." "Wrong. Angela, tell them this is all a misunderstanding." But I was done pretending to be the confused, frightened old woman she'd been terrorizing. "The only misunderstanding," I said calmly, "was yours. You thought you could push me around because I was old and alone. You thought you could steal my house and my money because I was too weak to fight back. And you thought you could threaten my life because no one would believe me if I accused you." "You recorded me," Sarah said, the realization hitting her. "I recorded everything. I confirmed. Your threats, your admissions, your plans to steal my assets, all of it. As the officers led Sarah away, she turned back to look at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she snarled. "Michael will never believe you. You've destroyed your relationship with your own son." "My relationship with my son was destroyed the day he chose you over me," I said. "But unlike you, he's not a criminal. Once he understands what you really are, he'll make better choices." After Sarah was taken away, Detective Mills sat with me at my kitchen table to review what had happened. "Mrs. Brooks, that was incredibly brave," he said. "The recording we got tonight, combined with the evidence your investigator gathered about her financial situation, should be more than enough to convict her on multiple charges." "What about Michael? Will he be charged with anything?" "Based on what we've seen, your son appears to be a victim of manipulation rather than a willing participant in the crimes," Detective Mills said. "But he'll need to be interviewed, and he may need counseling to understand how thoroughly he was deceived." "What happens now?" "Now Sarah Morrison goes to prison for a very long time," Detective Mills said. "Elder abuse and attempted murder are serious felonies, and given her financial desperation and history of targeting elderly victims, she's not going to be getting out anytime soon." As Detective Mills and his team finished their work and left my house, I sat alone in my kitchen and tried to process what had just happened. For months, I'd been living in fear, feeling powerless against someone who seemed to hold all the cards. But in the end, Sarah's own greed and desperation had been her undoing. She'd been so focused on getting access to my money that she'd revealed her true nature completely. Her threats had been recorded, her admissions captured, her crimes documented, beyond any possibility of denial. But perhaps most satisfying of all was the irony of how she'd destroyed herself. In her desperation to steal my assets to pay her debts, she'd committed crimes that would land her in prison for decades. Her violent creditors would never be paid, her debts would go into default, and she'd spend her remaining years in a cell, instead of enjoying the lifestyle she'd tried to steal from me. Sometimes, justice comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the rope people use to hang themselves is woven from their own greed and desperation. Michael came to see me the next morning, his face haggard and his eyes red from crying. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, collapsing into the chair where Sarah had sat the night before. "I had no idea. I thought she loved me. I thought she cared about you. She's very good at manipulation," I said gently. "She fooled both of us, at least initially." "But you figured it out," Michael said. "You saw through her when I couldn't. And instead of protecting you, I helped her pressure you. I'm so ashamed." "You were in love," I said. "Love makes us blind to things we should see clearly. It's not entirely your fault." "It is my fault," Michael insisted. "I chose her over you. I believed her lies about you being confused and needy. I actually thought you were being unreasonable for not wanting to give up your home." "What matters now is what we do going forward," I said. "Sarah is going to prison, her creditors are going to destroy her financially, and we're going to rebuild our relationship." "Can we?" Michael asked. "After everything I did? After how I betrayed you? Can we really go back to being mother and son?" I reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand I'd held when he was learning to walk, when he was scared of thunderstorms, when he was heartbroken over his first girlfriend. "We're always going to be mother and son," I said. "But you're going to have to earn back my trust, and you're going to have to learn to see me as a person who deserves respect, not a burden to be managed." "I will," Michael promised. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll prove to you that I'm worthy of being your son again." As we sat together in my kitchen, in the house that I'd fought so hard to keep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. The nightmare was over. Sarah was gone, her schemes had collapsed, and my son was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd almost lost. I was 73 years old, but I felt stronger and more capable than I had in years. I'd faced down a predator who'd tried to destroy me, and I'd won. I'd protected my home, my assets, and my independence. Most importantly, I'd shown myself that age doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise. And wisdom, as Sarah Morrison learned too late, is far more dangerous than she ever imagined. The house on Maple Street still stands, its wraparound porch and mature oak trees exactly as Robert and I designed them. I still tend my garden, still cook in my kitchen, still sleep in the bedroom we shared for so many years. But now I also have something I didn't have before: the absolute certainty that I can protect what matters to me. Sarah pushed me down the kitty stairs, thinking she could break my body and my spirit. Instead, she broke herself against my determination to survive. She pushed herself into bankruptcy, into prison, into a future that holds nothing but consequences for her crimes. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be a victim. Sometimes justice comes not from what you do to your enemies, but from what they do to themselves. And sometimes, when someone tries to push you down, the smartest thing you can do is stand back up and watch them fall. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.